Hi, my name is Pip and this is my review of Reni Eddo-Lodge's Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. To start this review, I'm just going to read a quote from page 2 of Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, because it's such an important quote and it was so early on in the book, and I just think it's a really important one to share. I distinctly remember a debate about whether racism was simply discrimination or discrimination plus power. Thinking about power made me realize that racism was about so much more than personal prejudice. It was about being in the position to negatively affect other people's life chances. This book is mostly a discussion about racism in Britain, but it's not exclusive to Britain. Reni Eddo-Lodge discusses important aspects of race history and slavery, and also some pop culture aspects of racism, like the debate about a black James Bond and a black Hermione. One of the early conversations in this book is about how the press constantly covers things like muggings, and even uses the word muggings, and predominantly reports them when they're occurring in black communities. And it basically just talks about how this continues to feed the racism that exists in Britain. And if you actually take a moment and really reflect on this, it makes you think a little bit about how much and what we see in the media, and wonder how much that has influenced like the police or the general public about the attitudes that they actually have to people of color and to crime in the white community, and also just how we digest news. Reporting on these sorts of crimes as if they only happen in areas where there's a higher population of people of color is like sort of a sneaky way of feeding racism into our everyday lives and into the news that we digest. And it kind of ends up being taken on as people's judgments that they have grown up surrounded by, and sometimes it ends up affecting their own relationships with other people, their attitudes towards other people, whether they have knowingly taken that on or not, because putting it in the media in that kind of way really is just a sneaky way of just making racism part of a cultural vibe of a city, a town, a country, and just continuing to feed that racism. And so you end up with people who are kind of adopting this mindset, either by willful ignorance, or they just were completely unaware of the fact that they were being fed information that was being fed through like a racist current. Some of the stories in here were pretty shocking, like how young black men had been arrested because they were clearly going to pickpocket or commit a crime, and they hadn't actually done anything. They were just walking around. Like, they were arrested on suspicion of intending to commit a crime. That's not illegal. And they're put in jail because they looked suspicious. And you're sitting there reading this story going, oh my God, that's just horrendous. And you look at the date and it was only in the 70s, so it really wasn't that long ago, and I'm honestly quite sure that sort of thing still happens now, and that there's still a total bias. The idea that generally, historically, there has been a significant element of racism in the law enforcement world within Britain, with police officers, and really in many countries, is explored in this book. And it's also something that was explored in a recent movie called American Son that stars Kerry Washington. And I mean, this is a really well put together movie, really well scripted. It has some really uncomfortable moments in it, but it's just such an important movie. And it's really important that you are uncomfortable and that you watch it and that you go all the way through it, particularly if you are white. I think even if you are trying to be as switched on as you can be, trying to be as aware and as educated as you can be, like, obviously you will never know what it is like to have that kind of bias directed at you. You will never know what that is like to have the experience of someone who is black, or feels that they have had that kind of just prejudice directed at them that is really, to be honest, very detrimental and very dangerous. And so this movie, American Son, and Reni Eddo-Lodge's book should be like required reading and watching, because I really think that it kind of opens your eyes to the realities of the situation, and you can't just have the blinkers on anymore. It's very real, and you need to be aware of it, and you need to continue to educate yourselves as best you can. While I was reading this book, I was reflecting on my own education and how little significance was placed on the history of people of color. So I studied ancient history and modern history, and like we studied the American Industrial Revolution from the perspective of the rich white dudes, and we studied the FBI from the perspective of J. Edgar Hoover, and that was pretty much it. There was, and JFK, and there was no mention of slavery beyond JFK and RFK being involved in civil rights and involved with allowing that student in the South to attend university when there was just, anyway. It was almost like the history we learnt was whitewashed. Like we weren't even, like it wasn't even mentioned that all these sort of racial injustices had occurred, that the civil rights movement was just a blip, that you mentioned a dot point that you had to tick off to talk about what a nice guy JFK was and what a nice guy RFK was. And I mean, the Vietnam War we studied was a separate kind of aspect of American history that we looked at, but like we didn't even look at Australian history really, and what effect we've had on the Indigenous population here. So it was like reading this book really made me look at the way I've been educated, and how and I had a great education, access to amazing schools and amazing teachers and things like that, but how kind of essentially whitewashing what students learn impacts, you know, another generation being ignorant essentially, and you delay change, and it's like a perfect opportunity to make young people aware of the fact that, you know, these things exist within our community, like sexism, racism, and beginning a conversation, and they just missed that opportunity. What I really loved in this book is the way Reni Eddo-Lodge divides the topic of racism kind of up into, it's not really chapters, but it's kind of into sections. Like for example, how racism and sexism are linked, and racism, feminism, and it's very interesting, because there are a lot of things that I read in this book that I have obviously seen or been exposed to at some level in my life that have made me uncomfortable, but never would I have been able to articulate why it made me uncomfortable in amongst a sea of white faces who didn't see anything wrong with that situation. So I mean, this book was just so important for me, and I really just think it's so important for everyone. It really should be required reading. I just think this book is so important, and it is so well written. There's conversation about how important representation is in what we consume, like in movies and in literature. There's this really heartbreaking moment where a young child asks their mother when they're going to turn white, because they thought that to be a good person you had to be white based on the media that we consume, and that's just awful that a child would ever feel that way, that they would ever look in a mirror and look at the color of their skin and think that they're any less, or that they're not a good person because of the color of their skin. I mean, that's just absolutely heartbreaking. But this book does go into those sorts of stories, and it does deal with them beautifully, and it is really very well written. I think this is really an important book for everyone to read, but if you're white, you really should really should read this. It's actually been a really important book for me personally, and very timely that I read this, because I have actually been battling someone in my inner circle for about 6 weeks or so about issues of sexism and racism, which I have found extremely distressing. And it was just interesting as I read this book and as it kind of discussed various attitudes of white people as to kind of why whatever they're doing is not racist, or why whatever they're doing is not sexist, or, you know, basically I was coming up against all of those, like being told you had to have a thicker skin and all of those sorts of things, and it's like easy for the white dude to say, like, but it was literally just like every excuse in the book was the excuse I was being given as to why this behavior was not only justified, but why I was the problem for actually speaking up and saying, excuse me, that's not right, you can't talk like that, you can't say those things, and you shouldn't be talking about those sorts of things in front of children. So I mean, I can only imagine if it's this frustrating for me to have conversations about race and sexism, how frustrating and heartbreaking and crushing it must be for people who feel like they're being very directly affected every day by issues of racism, to try and explain why what someone is doing is wrong, or why it's ignorant, or how we could just be better. I can't even imagine how frustrating and hurtful it must be to feel very directly attacked at times and misunderstood and held back and by people who are just, who could be better. So if you are looking for something to read for Black History Month that will help educate you, that is written by a Black author, then I really highly recommend this book. Again, I know that I can't possibly even begin to understand what people of color have been through, and I'm not trying to in any way say that I'm an expert. I'm just trying to say that this book is amazing and you should read it.